You are listening to Fast Track Podcast, the place to be to fast track your personal finance or fast track your business, or both, through a series of conversations with those who have learned it, done it, and made it. Before starting the episode, I have very exciting news to share with you. I am collaborating with financial Imagineer Matthias Richter to launch the Fast Track Money course. This 6-week online course is designed to help young professionals in their 20s to early 40s to learn how to save more, earn more, and invest, using money as a tool to fulfill your dreams. We teach you the proven method that Matthias has been using himself in the last 20 years and achieved financial independence. So sign up today on fasttrack.live/money course to transform your relationship with money from today. Today my guest is Steve Cummings, and if you have listened to this podcast for quite some time, you already know that Steve was on my podcast before, and he is now living in Taipei, originally from the USA. And he's an American expat in Taipei teaching English, and he made Taiwan his home base. And he loves traveling and adventures, and he learned how to travel hack, save money, and invest better for his future. He's very savvy with investing. Therefore, today I invited him coming over to the show again. We will talk about ETFs, and he has written many articles about the ETF investing. So in this episode, I'm going to ask him many questions about ETFs so that you can start to put together your own investment portfolio. So let's get into it. Hey, hello, Steve. Welcome back to the Fast Track Podcast.
Thank you for having me back on, Yalzi.
Yeah, I saw you have written a lot of articles about ETFs. So I thought, why not bring you to my podcast again to help our audience understand what ETF is and why it is so interesting for average investors and exactly how they can put up a ETF investment portfolio. So I think you might be a perfect person that I should bring into the show now.
Well, thank you for having me on. I love talking about ETFs and writing about them. I've got a couple more articles coming out this week about some tech ETFs. So hopefully I can give some good insight to educate more investors on what an ETF is.
Yeah. Also, let's start with the very first question. If in case some of the audience have not heard about ETF or they have heard about it but do not understand it fully, can you tell us what exactly is ETF?
So an ETF, ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. So it is a pool of securities or stocks that can be traded on the stock market like a stock. But it's not a stock because it's a whole bunch of stocks together into one fund.
And how does it work? Like when you say it's a whole bunch of stocks together into one fund, some of the people have asked me in the past, how much does it cost? Is it very expensive? If they have to buy a lot of fund, how would you answer that?
Well, brokerage companies, they'll come together and they will they'll look at an index like the S&P 500 is a famous index in the USA. And across the world, everybody knows about it. It's got the top 500 companies in the USA. And so a brokerage company may want to make a fund of all those companies. So all the 500 companies, and they'll weigh them by market cap, depending on how they're weighted in the index. And so they'll basically buy shares of each company and kind of weight them towards that. So let's say the S&P 500, you have Apple, you have Microsoft, those are the top two. And Apple is about 6% of the S&P 500. So an ETF will basically have like Apple, Microsoft, they'll have Amazon, they'll have those 500 companies. And then they'll buy about 6%, make Apple basically 6%, just so that it can match it. So the S&P 500 goes up, let's say 20% in 1 year, your ETF should go up about 20%. Now, it won't go perfectly up because, like you mentioned before, there are fees associated with ETFs. And so those are some things that will bring the return a little bit down, just a tiny bit, depending upon how much the fee is and how much it costs to do business.
Yeah. I'll have a question for the fees later. So let's look at the ETF that has a basket of 500 different companies. How would the fund price one of the fund shares? Just give our audience some basic understanding. Yeah. How can they buy? How much would they expect to spend to invest in this kind of ETFs?
It would depend upon how big I would say the ETF is. So what I mean by that is how much money is being invested into it. Like if you have, not just by 500 companies, but if you have like an ETF that has like $1 trillion in it, well, no, that's a big ETF, but if it has like 10 or 20 billion dollars, the price is going to be a little bit higher. If it has, let's say, just like $1 billion, the price is going to be a little bit lower. And that's because maybe the ETF is newer. In more older ETFs, they're traded a little bit more and they have more money into it, which makes it easier to trade, like on options. But that's something different. But like one of the famous ETFs is SPY, which is stands for SPY. It's made by State Street. And this was created in 1993 as an ETF for the S&P 500. Now, this price is much higher than most of the other S&P 500 because it's got a lot more money invested into it. And that's why the price fluctuates up and down.
So the price of one ETF does not mean like one, they all tracking the same index, for example, S&P 500, and one ETF might be more expensive per share price, might be more expensive than the other one just because how much liquidity or how much money were invested in the ETFs.
That is correct, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And another thing I want to differentiate here, just for those who have not started invested in ETFs, is that we talk about S&P 500 is an index, but there are different companies that they are tracking the same index and they're all ETFs. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of S&P 500 ETFs, and basically brokerage companies that will come up and they'll create their own ETF. Like I said, yeah, State Street, they have SPY. You have Vanguard, they have VOO. And then you have like iShares, I think it's IVV. Those are all ETFs. And so basically a brokerage company is going to come out and they're going to make their own. And what they need is they need a lot of funding to come in and be able to buy shares so then they can create this fund so then they can put it on the market and sell to other people.
Mm-hmm. And why it is so interesting for average investors to look into ETFs instead of stock picking?
Well, it makes it easier to not, I guess, to not lose almost. I can't say lose because like if you pick one stock, I mean, you're not very diversified. But if you have an ETF that has 500 stocks or has 1,000 or 4,000, and if one of those companies goes up, the ETF goes up. But if one of those companies just crashes out, maybe it doesn't go down as far. I mean, you have more companies brings in more diversity. It makes it more diversified. So then if one company fails, maybe you don't see it as much. But if a whole bunch of companies all are in the green one day, then it's going to go up in price. It makes it easier on your portfolio. Like the S&P 500 went up about 26-27% in 2021. Now, if you have an ETF that tracks all 500 companies, your ETF's going to go up that price. Now, let's say I owned a company like Apple, and Apple did poorly. Well, they didn't do poorly in 2021, but let's say they did, and someone else has the ETF at S&P 500. They did really well, but Apple did not. Well, I mean, obviously, the ETF's going to do better because it's not weighted by one company. And when you're trying to pick out just one stock, you have to do research. You need to look at their financials. You need to look at what the company is trying to sell, what profits coming in, where they projected. You want to see the price towards expense ratio. You want to see all sorts of different things, and it becomes hard, becomes confusing, and you have to do a lot of studying. Now, with an ETF, you don't have to worry about that as much because usually they're picked by the brokerage company, and usually an ETF is done passively. So the fees are very low. The brokerage company is tracking an index, and therefore, if stocks go up, your ETF's going to go up. Stocks go down, ETF goes down. But in the long run, not just one day or a month or a year, but maybe 5, 10, 20 years, it's just going to keep going up because it is very diversified.
Yeah, that's a very clear, very good explanation. Thanks, Steve. I often have people ask me, they have to spend a lot of time to invest and understand, read the news, how to start investing. And my answer is always look into ETFs.
Yeah, it makes it easier. You can start with a little bit of money and you can just go in. You're like, okay, I got a hang of this. I can automate it. I can keep it going. And boom, you got like a big portfolio full of winning investments.
Yeah, and you don't need that much money to invest in individual stocks. Like through one ETF, basically, let's say how much is one share of SPY?
I know VOO is about 380.
Yeah, let's say if you buy one share
427. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
So 427. If you have 427 US dollars, you buy one share of this ETF tracking S&P 500. You have a tiny little bit shares of all those 500 companies. So as an investor, you don't actually need that much money to invest in 500 different companies, right? So it's a very good vehicle for diversification.
Yeah, and companies like Amazon, one share of Amazon costs around $3,000.
Mm-hmm.
But with VOO, you're getting it for $427, and you can keep buying more and more, and you'll still have Amazon.
Yeah.
You just won't have like that one full share. It's like a little bit of fractions, but you also have Apple. You also have Google. You have companies that may have not made it up yet and people haven't heard about, kind of like Tesla. Tesla just came out of nowhere, and then boom, you don't have to individually invest into one share of Tesla. It's already there in the ETF.
Yeah. And the other ETF that is very popular nowadays is VT. I know people who only invest in VT. So earlier you mentioned S&P 500, that is well known now. So what is the VT from Vanguard?
VT is a total world ETF. It's got the US and it's also got ex-US companies in it. Usually when people talk about VT, it's because it's like an all-around ETF. You want to buy everything in the world, you buy VT. And it's that easy. You want to buy the best companies in the world, VT is the ETF to buy.
Yeah.
And that just gives you exposure to not only US companies, but you can get exposure to Chinese companies, Australian companies, Japanese, Korean. You get exposure to the companies in Europe, like in Germany and Switzerland. You get companies everywhere. And that makes it very diverse because all of a sudden you have companies that may spring out of nowhere and you still have a piece of it, which is good.
And the return is also not so bad. I think it's around 7-8% annualized return in the last 10 years or so.
That's a pretty good return.
Yeah, that's pretty good return. And in a way that you bet on the global economy, right? Like some people ask me, oh, what if the market crashed? What if this happened? I was like, if you bet on the world economy, when the market crashed, when that crashed, you don't worry about your stocks anymore. You worry about your food, your water, your survival. The apocalypse comes, so you don't worry about your ETF. So in a way, I like the VT because it was really for people who really don't need to spend a lot of money investing in the stock market, doesn't need to stock picking, just bet on the global economy. If you think the world evolves, the world keeps developing, the technology, it's advanced by itself, then you believe in the humanity's advancement, then VT is like a representation of that belief. Yeah, and again, we have to highlight, right? Whatever ETFs we're talking about here is not financial advice.
That's true. And the good thing is it makes investing simple. I mean, instead of stressing and trying to do a lot of research, why not invest in something that owns everything?
Yeah.
Which makes it simple. All you have to do is just put an automatic order. Don't worry. It'll automatically just buy, and you got lots of companies that will go up, and in the long run, you've got a great portfolio.
Yes. And coming back to the fees, right? So when people start to put together their own ETF portfolio, imagine how would they start? What should they look at? There's info sheet, investor key information sheet, and there's lots of informations there. What are the key information they need to pay attention to?
One of the things I like to look at, I automatically look at when I go to look at an ETF, is the expense ratio. Now, the expense ratio is the amount of money it costs to operate and manage this ETF. Some ETFs are very cheap. Some ETFs will have a higher expense ratio, and therefore it will cost you more money in the long run. And so I always go and look at the expense ratio, because if I can save money, I'm going to do it, because maybe I can find a brokerage company that has same kind of ETF, but with a lower expense ratio. That would be the number one thing, because money talks. And if you can save in the long run, that's great, because 1% is going to cost you about $100 for every 10,000 you invest, and that can add up. That's about 10,000 if you have $1 million portfolio. Now, if you can break down that expense ratio lower to maybe 0.04%, 0.09%, wow, you just cut out a whole bunch of money out of that, and then you can still invest in $1 million portfolio with 0.04% is only $400 coming out of your pocket. Well, what are you going to do? You want to spend 10,000 or 400? Well, that choice is easy. You're going to spend just the 400. That's the number one thing I'll do. Number two thing is I'm going to take a look and see what are the top 10 companies that are invested in the ETF, and what percentage of those top 10 companies are allocated in the ETF. Most of the S&P 500, like VOO and SPY, have the same top 10, and they're about 28% of the entire portfolio. That shows me that not one or two or 10 stock companies, stocks, are dominating the entire portfolio. There's one ETF, a tech ETF called VGT. It's from Vanguard. Their two top stocks is Apple and Microsoft. Well, that's not too bad. Apple and Microsoft are good companies, but they take up about 40% of the entire ETF. There's 365 companies in that ETF. So then you see like, well, if one of those fails, then you just hope the other like 60% will do well. So it's weighted way too much into those two. It's a good ETF as long as Apple and Microsoft are doing well, but you're going to want to look to see if there's more diversification. Instead of that one, maybe you may look like at QQQ. QQQ is another tech ETF that does like the NASDAQ 100, and they're more evenly weighted. Like instead of 40% of the ETF, Apple, Microsoft, it's more like 20%, which looks a lot better and makes you feel better. Like if one of those were to drop, then you wouldn't lose as much money as VGT. Those are the two things I definitely look at. I want to make sure how diversified it is. I want to look at the fees. And maybe I also want to look at the yield. The yield is the percentage that the ETFs can give back as a form of a dividend. Sometimes dividend investors, they'll look at dividend ETFs. A famous one in the US is called SCHD. It is a Charles Schwab dividend ETF. It's got about 100 companies. And it's a very famous one, and the yield's around 3%. And so that's good because then you know, okay, I'm going to get 3% of a dividend back. And all these companies are dividend growth companies. So they're going to grow. And so they'll grow in the value, and they'll also give me back a dividend. So some people like to get that money back. Some people want to be more into tech and see more growth. Some people may want to do everything. You get like VT. So those are the kind of three things I kind of look at is what are the fees, what's the diversification, and what is the yield or the dividends that they're going to be giving out.
Yeah. Another thing I also want to add is some of the ETFs, they are physical, and then there's like a synthetic. I don't know if you pay attention to those as well.
No, I haven't.
So the physical ones are the ones that the companies or the fund, they actually have those shares. Or if it's the gold, yeah, they actually have the backing. And synthetic is it's on the paper. They don't have the actual holding of those.
I think in the US we call them derivatives. I'm not sure. But I do know in Australia, some of their retirement funds, or they call them a super, they'll sell you ETFs. And instead of having the physical holdings, like you said, they have the paper ones, which in my opinion, I feel like the paper ones are less safe because they don't actually own it. It's kind of like a mock. It's almost like a little fake, but it's not.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion. It's not advice or anything. It's just my opinion.
Indeed. As far as I understand that, it's often recommended to buy the ETFs that they call it product structure, and then you have the physical. It's better to buy the physical than synthetic, but sometimes you just cannot buy the physical. I think it's about which one. Maybe it's oil or something that you just cannot buy the physical. Yeah. And since you are the US citizen, do you need to consider some tax implications where this fund is from, or you don't need to because most of the ETFs are in the US?
Yeah, I mean, taxes are always a thing in the US. And one of the ETFs that you can get is VXUS, which is an international ETF. So instead of getting VT, you could always get VTI, which is the total US stock market, and you can get VXUS. VXUS gives you more international exposure. That is in case you don't want to get to VT. Now, with VXUS, there's some different tax implications because some of it's coming from overseas. And so you have to worry about some of those, and it's got a little bit higher of a yield. So you got to worry about that, but you also get a foreign tax credit as a part of that as well for it being separate instead of VT, where it's all together. But with most of these, a lot of people will put them in a taxable account, or even we have retirement accounts called IRA, individual retirement accounts. But in a taxable accounts, they're more there's tax implications. So the higher the dividends, the more you'll get taxed depending on your income level. There's also gains. Let's say my ETF goes up $1,000 and I sell it, and the gain would be $1,000. I sell for that $1,000 gain. I will have possibly a tax on the gain depending upon my income level once again. Now, with ETFs, you can make taxes a little bit easier because let's say you are under an income level and you have like some massive gains. What you can do, you can sell some of these ETFs and then buy them back at the same time. So you can kind of realize the gain and then you buy them back, and that's called tax gain harvesting. So then you lessen the gain. Like if I have an ETF that I bought at 200, it goes up to 300, and I sell for 300, but then rebuy it back at 300. Well, I got a gain. And if I'm under a tax bracket where I don't have to pay taxes on it, then it's almost like 0%. And then it's back up to 300, but I still have the same shares.
Then why do people do that? If you have 100 gain, you sell at 300, then you buy back at 300, then the gain is not realized, I mean, you did the transaction, but then the money goes to the shares again. What's the point of doing that?
It's like a paper. You realize the gain, but you can subtract that from your taxes. Okay, let's say, so in the US, if you make under 40,000 as a single or 80,000 as a couple, any gains or dividends is taxed at 0%. Once it goes up to the next level, like if you're at 42 or maybe 82,000, it's taxed at 15%. So if you're under that, and let's say I'm at 30,000, and if I want, I can realize a gain of up to 10,000 without paying any taxes.
Yes.
And then next year, let's say I actually want to sell those, and now the ETF has no gains, so I pay no taxes if my income goes up. So I realize the gain in order to kind of have no gains in the future. Does that make sense?
So this year, if you are under 40,000, this tax bracket, so you realize the gain by selling your ETF $100 higher. So you actualize already the gain, right? But you don't have to pay tax, right?
Yes.
And then next year, you buy it back at 300 USD per share.
No, I can buy it back at the same time as I sell it. So I sell it and then I just buy it back.
But if you don't do anything, you still don't need to pay the tax, and you still do not have the $100 in your pocket.
That is correct. It's a tax. It's almost like a tax, not avoidance in the future, where let's say I buy the ETF $100 and it ends up in the future at 1,000. Now that's a huge gain. If I were to sell it and I'm in a certain tax bracket, maybe I have to pay a lot of taxes on it. If the years before that, I start realizing the gains little by little by little, and let's say I go and sell it and I have zero gains, then I don't owe any taxes.
Oh, I think I slowly understand. It's on paper that you realize the gain on paper in the year that you might not need to pay a lot of tax, but then you still have the ETFs. But later on, when you are in the higher tax bracket and you sell them, but you already realized the gains in previous years, so your tax might be lower.
Yes.
I need to digest this a little bit later.
This is called tax gain harvesting.
It's in the US.
It's in the US. I would say not many people do it. I met a man in Taipei. His name is Jeremy Jacobson. He writes the blog Go Curry Cracker. And he taught me about this, and he talked about it all the time. It's like every year I sell stocks off, I rebuy them back. So then in the future, I don't have any gains to be taxed. And I was like, what is this magic?
Yeah,
most people think of tax loss harvesting. Let's say you buy an ETF for $200, it goes down to $150. Well, in order to, you have one that go up and you have one go down. If you have a whole bunch that go down and loses money, you can sell those to kind of alleviate taxes, but don't sell, just buy and hold for the long term.
Yeah. So one point adding on that for those who are not in the US. So for example, me, I'm based in Switzerland. And I know that for me, the best solution is I buy ETFs that is from, for example, Vanguard, Ireland, because Ireland has a tax treaty with the US. Otherwise, the companies would only receive 70% because 30% is withholding tax. And then imagine the Ireland Vanguard only gets 70% of dividends. Then it pays me in Switzerland. And then there's another layer of tax between Ireland and Switzerland.
Yeah, and I'm in Taiwan, and Taiwan doesn't have a tax treaty with the US either. So they have a 30% withholding tax as well. So basically, any dividends that come in, you get 70% because the US doesn't have the tax treaty. I think Australia's got a 15% tax treaty with the US, but still, Texas can eat away.
Yes. It could be interesting for the audience to look at if the country where you are living in right now, if you have a tax treaty with either US, if you have some investment from the US and other countries, then choose the ETFs that from a country that has a tax treaty with the US.
Well, and I know there are companies in many different countries to sell ETFs. I know Vanguard's got an office in Australia as well.
Yeah.
They've got offices everywhere. They keep expanding. They can create ETFs for your own country to kind of help out. Because I know in Australia, they got different tax laws. And so they'll have ETFs that kind of help out with taxes in certain ways. And so if you look at your country, and you look at companies that create ETFs, first of all, I would look at kind of the companies they hold. Look at if the tax treaty is with the US. So if it's like a US ETF, see how much taxes are being taken out. And also look at the fees. Sometimes companies will sneak those fees in. I was talking to my brother about his retirement fund. He's like, yeah, look, I got all these great ETFs. And I'm looking at each one of them. I was like, oh, these fees are big. And he's like, but they're ETFs. You talk about these. And so sometimes we don't look at the fees in these ETFs. Like they could be 0.6%, 0.9%, 0.5%. It's better looking at the ones that are maybe 0.1% or 0.03%, somewhere that's lower.
Yeah, indeed. When it comes to long-term investing and over time, the fees can actually really eat up a lot of your profit. So if given the choices, of course, choosing the ones that has a lower fee, that makes more sense, right?
It makes sense to me. I like the low costs and I like the fees not taken out of the return.
Yeah, I remember recently you told me about the QQQM. I was not aware of that. And I was like, it's amazing that tracking exactly the same index, almost exactly the same performance, just from a different company and lower fee. Why not? Right. I mean, this is just Steve and me, our personal choices. I mean, if you guys like a certain fund from certain company that you have more trust into it, then do your own research, make your own judgment. I think at the end of the day, it's your personal decision and how you put things together. So my last question about the ETF is, how can someone put up an ETF portfolio? Do you suggest them to look at the world, to look at the markets, to look at industry, or just a general guideline? How would someone to put up their own ETF investment portfolio?
First of all, I would try to get one that's very broad and diversified. So if you could get a world ETF, that would be good. If you could get one, like if you're in the US, maybe more, if you can get more US, or even if you're not in the US and you had like one that's got lots of different companies that makes it diversified. Because if you have 500 to 1,000 to maybe 7,000 companies, that makes it very diversified. It's a good way to create a good portfolio, like VT. VT is a great one, or even any ETFs that have more, like a whole bunch of US companies, because most of us, we know the US companies. You got Apple, you have Google, you have Amazon. A lot of these companies, it's hard if the ETF doesn't hold these companies. It's easier to just grab a big US one. Sorry for my bias, but US just has a lot of companies. But it's good to also have a broad exposure to also international companies as well, because you got Toyota and Samsung. You have companies like Pfizer that's in Germany and all these other companies everywhere. Then that would be probably a good chunk of your portfolio. That makes it balanced. Secondly, if you want to get into different sectors, look at different sectors. Like, let's say if you want to do tech, look at something that has more, an even amount of tech. Like we just talked about QQQ and QQQM. I just said this very fast, but it's 3 Qs and 3 Qs and an M. Those are tech ETFs that can really help out if you want maybe 10% into tech. You can get one of those ETFs and kind of make sure it's around 10%. Maybe you want something that's all dividends. So you can add like a dividend ETF into that big portfolio. But what I would suggest, just my opinion, is to have a more all-around ETF that encompasses a lot of companies, a lot of US companies and a lot of big international companies.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very well summarized. I think what you talk about really can apply to majority of the average investors if you don't want to spend 8 to 10 hours per day studying the chart. Again, I would encourage you to do a little research on your own, understand what suits you, because Steve talked about like dividends ETF, then we also talk about index tracking ETFs. Find out what suits you in your personal situation. Then probably today what we talk about is to give you the fundamental knowledge to understand what ETF is, and then what you need to do afterwards. It's really depends on you, right? Like you understand how it works, what are the fees, what are the tax implications, and how much you want to invest for what time horizon. So again, thank you so much for being here, Steve. Thank you so much for contributing to this very educational content for our audience.
Thank you for having me. It was a joy to talk with you about this stuff.
Yeah, and you write a lot of very interesting and useful articles. So would you mind sharing with us or the audience where they can, read more about what you wrote and follow you online if they're interested?
Yeah, thank you. I write at the Frugal Expat, and that is where I put most of my articles and posts. And I also am online on Twitter, and my handle is at the Frugal Expats 1, which is the number 1. And you can find me. I'm always on there. Well, not always. I work as well, but I'm there nighttime in the morning, and I'm trying to have discussions with other people. So come follow me. Come ask me questions. I'm open ears.
And if you're wondering why Steve calls himself Frugal Expat, I have another episode that I interview Steve about his personal journey to achieve financial independence, his lifestyle, his travels, and it's really, really like my kind of like a dream life, because during the COVID, I didn't travel at all. I was really envious. So check that episode out and follow Steve on Twitter, check out his blog, and thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fast Track Podcast. Show me your support by liking this episode and sharing it with a friend. Join the Facebook group at Fast Track Podcast 1, or you can find us on Instagram, YouTube, and of course the homepage fasttrack.life. See you in the next episode.